military at some point in your career, would you please walk forward? Anybody that's been in the military, please come on forward. Got some that are going to be show their second service. Anybody else that's ever served in the military? Okay, very good. Your dad did? Very good. Well, we want to honor these folks today. I don't know if you know, today is a special day. It's the day that the armistice was signed for World War I. I was wondering where you went to, Bill. Okay, very good. And it's the day when the armistice was signed 100 years ago today. It was signed in France, which was a little bit different than our actually time style, but it was actually signed on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. And so I want to honor those that have served in the military. So I'm going to ask them each to say the years they served, or the years they served, whatever it was, and the branch that they served in. Okay? They're not all going to be Army. Start here.
The branch is easy, the Navy. The year's a little harder. I think it was 80 to 84.
Okay, Army, 89 to 2015.
Okay, Army, 1966, 1968.
I started out in the Army, then I came to my senses and went to the Navy. And it was from 1986 to 1990.
Okay, let's give a round of applause to these guys, if you would, please. And I'm going to ask, let's take it better. We're going to take a picture before these guys. Oops, another one just shot. Late to church, man, I'll tell you. That's me. Come up here. Come on up here. Give us your branch, and that'll explain everything, and the years you served.
I was in the United States Marine Corps for 9 years. I started in 2010.
And he just left about a month ago for right now. So I'm going to ask these guys to get a little closer and let's take a picture of everybody. Earpiece on so I can actually be heard and seen. Go to the next slide, if you would. I don't know how much you know about it. As I said, 11th hour, the 11th month, 11th day, the armistice was signed. It was a really big deal. First World War One was supposed to end all wars. It obviously did not. We had a Second World War. If someone wants to Google it on their phone, they probably got their phone sitting right here. I do not know how many died in the First World War, so maybe somebody can let me know, but I do know that the armistice was signed like 5 o'clock in the morning on the 11th, 5 to 6 o'clock in the morning. It was to go into effect at 11 o'clock on that day, so they would have the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Who found that number for me? How many died how many? 17 million? Lots of people. And looking at it, the armistice was actually signed at I say between 5 and 6. It was delayed for 6 hours, going into effect till the 11th hour. And during that last 6 hours, from the armistice being signed to the time it actually went into effect, 3,000 more American soldiers died. So that can tell you the effect that this war had on us. And of course, without that war, our nation and the whole world would look a lot differently, as with the Second World War. So I honor these guys that are here with me. Today's Veterans Day. It's not Memorial Day. We're not honoring those that have died, although we do honor those at all times. But those that have served, and I often wondered, hey, I've not been in a combat zone or shot out. I mean, I eventually did get my combat badge because I was in a zone, Kuwait, which was considered the Middle East during the Iraqi War. But, you get that feeling, was I ever, I wasn't really there. And I think Ron was in during the Vietnam era, weren't you? He stayed stateside, but he was also in the Vietnam era. So, and I came to realize that, if you put on the uniform, you allow yourself to be called up to duty. And it doesn't matter where you wind up, because where you wind up, you're replacing somebody so they can go to battle, or you go yourself. And so Every person that has served deserves our thanks for what they've done, and I'm not saying this for me. I'm saying for others, and I'll tell you others who deserves the accolades or the families, because they often get missed. And you walk up, and if you're in uniform, someone will say, "Oh, thank you for your service," but behind that is a family, a wife, kids, oftentimes who have not been with their spouse or their father or mother. Could have been a mother that had been gone. And for that period of time. And oftentimes I think it's harder on the spouse, because the spouse, my wife sat there for the 2 different times I was deployed for that year, and every day there was a blank spot at that table. And when they needed somebody to take the kids someplace, there was nobody to do it. Where I was, everybody's in uniform. We all looked differently. I sat down with the guys to eat, and I didn't expect my wife and kids to be sitting across from me. So I'm not saying it was easy being gone from them at all, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm saying I sometimes think being out in a place where you know you're serving your country and so forth can sometimes be easier on the soldier than it can, or service member, whichever branch, than it is on the families that stay at home. And that's why we have so many families that do wind up breaking up, unfortunately, in the military. So pray for our service members. They're still being deployed all over the world. This is a picture of Armistice Day in London, and it's the American troops marching through the center of London in the Victory Day Parade. And so you can just, you just can't imagine the accolades, the joy that this war was finally over as we moved on. So today is Armistice Day, or as we call it now, Veterans Day, and I'm not going to spend the whole sermon doing that. I just wanted to recognize that at the beginning of my sermon as we began this morning. We're going to be in the book of 2 Timothy, so please turn with me there. I'm going to take my water here because I need that. Sometimes I wonder if this is from all the desert time I spent. And we're going to stand and read the scriptures together, so please stand with me. We're actually going to go through the first 16 verses of today, but we're going to read the first 8 as we start. And I'm going to ask that let's all read it together, if we would, today, in unison. Just read loud enough so you can't hear the person next to you. Begin. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older woman as mothers, and the women as sisters, in all purity. Honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You may be seated. Certainly, as we look at today's passage, there are 2 subjects a little bit. It starts off with how to treat and rebuke those that are in the church who are not doing what they should do. And then there's also the section which deals with widows, and we'll spend a good bit of our time there today. And I think that's an important thing to look at. How do we take care of widows? You know, it's been the Christian church which has done this through the centuries. Often now we expect the government to do it, and the government does do it in many cases, whether we think it's good or bad. But they've expanded it way beyond widows and orphans to a lot of different people, and of course there's a lot of different ideas out there of how you provide for people that are in need. And some people are in need, and some people like being in need and will never be to the place of being able to support others. And so it's a difficult thing in today's society. You know, as you see folks that are sometimes even standing on the corner taking money. I remember I saw one guy over in Trenton here. The person in front of me gave him a bill, and I don't know what the bill was, but as soon as they gave him the bill, he walked around the back of the car and took off down the street. Didn't even wait for the next car. Don't know where he was headed, what he was going to buy, but he had his money and he was gone. And, you just wonder about it sometimes. But today we're going to talk about taking care of widows, as well as the first couple verses which talk about exhorting fellow members like family with respect. Why do you have to exhort a fellow member of the family of God? Well, Paul's writing to Timothy because there were people that weren't doing what they should be doing. They weren't acting right. They weren't following God right. In some cases, they might have been in sin. In some cases, they might have been causing disturbances. And sometimes it's harder to take care of those folks that are even older than you. But it says whether they're older or younger. In fact, we were having the elders meeting the other week, and someone says, how do you handle confrontation? That's always hard, isn't it? How do you handle confrontation? We're required to handle confrontation. Now, it depends. It'll be on different levels. If somebody's outright sinning, then you've got to confront them straight up, Maybe it's a borderline, they just got a bad attitude, B.A. Baracus of the A-team. I don't know. But, that's just a bad attitude. And sometimes, is that something you confront them with authority from the elders? No, but they do need to be confronted. And as Paul was writing to Timothy, he said, you got to be able to confront people who are causing dissension or who are sinning. And, of course, we have a lot of different places in the Scripture where it talks about that. So we'll look at some of those things. But let's take a look at the Scriptures right now and start off with this first part and the first couple of verses here. And it says in various places we need to deal with it. In 1 Corinthians 5, 6, and 7, it says we need to deal with those that have problems and issues and aren't following the Lord like they should. And in Matthew chapter 18, chapter 18, verses 15 to 18, it talks about how we should handle those type of things. Go one-on-one if a person is in sin or offending you. Then take another person with you, and if that doesn't work, take it to the elders, and if it doesn't work, take it to church leadership, take it to the church. There's a list of different ways in which we handle problems, and really that's a character issue. How do we handle issues? Because a lot of us wind up with tough times or things we need to talk to somebody about, and that's always hard. And we need to be willing to talk to a person in a way that is genuinely caring and not, well, you did this and, this is wrong, but, a little bit softer tone, but be able to do it respectfully, but we can't back away from it. Because, sometimes people are just blind to what's happening. It says, do not sharply rebuke. Sharply rebuke indicates, coming to blows almost, yelling at a person, being really angry. That's not the way we handle disputes or problems or challenges. It says, but rather appeal to them or exhort. The word exhort is to come alongside of, It's when you kind of walk around and put your arm around somebody and say, hey, how are you feeling? What's going on in your life? Something's wrong. Rather than getting in their face and, nailing them, which is the way some people tend to handle disputes and problems. The Greek is actually parakaleo, come along, to call alongside of, as we look at that. So in this section of Scripture, it says, the older men are to be treated as fathers. Now, in this day and age, I'm not sure we have a respect for parents like we should a lot of times, but as you would a father, that's how you're supposed to talk to an older person. Give them the respect that is due them. And there's many scriptures in the Bible that talk about it. It says in Leviticus 19:32, you shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged. Many things can be overlooked by a father, They're willing to overlook things on us, but some things cannot be overlooked. Sin, spreading disharmony, it says in Proverbs. There's a number of Proverbs. If you want to look them up, just look at Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 and 19. It talks a lot about how we can, how the tongue and what we do just spreads disharmony, or a critical spirit. A spirit can also be a problem. But there comes a time when something hard has to be shared, and Paul knew that it would be difficult on Timothy. So he says, stacks it up as you go back last week, don't despise your youthfulness, step up the plate, and do what needs to be done. Talk to people. Don't get mad, but honor them as an older person. Now, what about a younger person? What do you do? A younger person is your own peer? How can you treat them? You can treat them more harshly, right? No. It says treat them as brothers. Now, I know this may need some explanation, right? Some of you have brothers, and it's not coming to blows. It's not treating them with disrespect. We need to treat them as brothers, You give a little bit of honor to your parents, but, when you treat as a brother, you're supposed, what's the Bible say in, I call it the 11th commandment? Do what? Love one another, okay? It says in Matthew, if you have something against your brother, leave your tithe and go get it right first. Because how can you honor God with your tithe and your presence and worship and so forth if you really got something mad and angry and something wrong against your brother? Go fix it. get it fixed. So it says to treat them with respect also. Don't fly off handle. Older women, treat them as mothers. Same thing as the older men. Treat older women as if they were your mom. Don't get angry at them, but don't get in their face. But it's tough. Anybody had to talk to their mom about something and that was unpleasant? It's not always easy to approach your mother, is it? About something, especially if you don't like them doing something. But yet, you have to honor them. And so it is with the church. As Timothy was told to approach these people, he says, approach the young women as mothers, and then the old women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters, right? As sisters, as you would a sister. It's kind of interesting. Lois spent a year in Israel. And, a lot of times you have the Israelis, they'll be fighting amongst themselves. But let somebody from outside the family, outside a non-Israeli, attack them, and guess what? They're one. And sometimes that happens in the family too, doesn't it? You have brothers and sisters fighting cats and dogs, at home. They go to school and somebody picks on their little sister. What happens? Bad news. Take care, little sis. And that's the kind of attitude it wants us to do. It wants us to be sure that we as people are treating them as sisters, not as we would at home if we get into a fight with them or just argue with them, but be careful with them and protect them. And then also it adds a word here. It says, in all purity. Why do you think it adds in all purity, especially with the young women? Well, this can take a man down, a pastor down as fast as anything. You got to be careful. It said that Billy Graham would not even get into an elevator by himself with a female. Now, it's very difficult. I've tried all my life to make sure that I try to be as discreet in this area as possible. If you walk back into our Christian educational ring, you'll find that there's a window in every single door. We did that so people could look in order to give transparency, you might say. But sometimes it becomes difficult. A woman stops by and wants to talk to you, and now we have the daycare here, so it's a little easier, but you're a pastor of a solo church, you're the only guy, and someone wants to talk to you as counseling, we say, oh, don't come back, I'll have to call my wife or get somebody else in here before I can talk to you, You have to just be discreet. It's not always easy. But it is, and it is pliable. I know I've counseled some women, and not that people have been around. It's not been like just me and her in the building, but the woman's had really tough times. And sometimes it's at home, sometimes it's other places. And I realize that they're on the edge. On the outside, you saw them on a weekday, you think they were kind of a hard-nosed kind of person who was just really, but inside, man, when you start asking the right questions and finding out what's really going on in their lives, and someone will listen to them, they were like putty, And I realized I've got to watch it because they are just at the point where they appreciate being listened to, and I've brought up some stuff that they really need to deal with in their lives. And this is where, as we're going to look at some of the things coming on here, where older women can be helpful in the church because others need your advice. They need your listening ear. So as you're talking to people in the church, you need to make sure that you are accurate, truthful, but use that Ephesians expression, speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. If you speak the truth without love, you hurt feelings. And it's been done here in this church. It's been done probably by some of you. Speaking the truth, but not in love. But then there's some who wind up being so loving, they don't what? Speak the truth. And they don't tell a person how they really come off or what's really challenging. And so we need to be able to speak the truth in love. And that's part of what he's talking about here. When there's problems, Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth in love. After finishing this part, he goes on to another subject. And it's a related subject. How do we take care of people in the church? And he starts talking about widows. And he has a whole section here for the next 14 verses that talk about widows. And we want to take a look at these. And you might say, well, I'm not a widow. Well, there's things about here how to take care of widows, how widows should act. And there's all kinds of different parts of it. So please listen as we talk through this section. We're going to start off with the first verses that we did right just now. Take care of widows who are truly needy, verses 3 through 8. There's a quote in one of the books I was reading for this sermon. It says, "It is a religious duty for the children and grandchildren to take care of widows." say it again. It is a religious duty for their children and grandchildren to take care of widows. Now, we talk about tithing in the church. We say give a tenth of your money to the church, okay? That's the standard. You really should be doing that. I mean, that's kind of God's law in the Old Testament, you know? And when you look at laws in the New Testament, he didn't lessen them, he expanded them, you know? Like in the Old Testament, if you commit adultery, you're wrong. In the New Testament, if you have think of adultery in your heart, then that's wrong, you know? So he always makes them a little bit more stringent, a little bit more challenging in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, a lot of us, and even myself for many years, thought, you know, there was one tithe. There really wasn't. There were actually 3 tithes in the Old Testament. 2 of them were given annually, and 1 of them was given every 3rd year. Now, I'm not going to preach on giving today, but if you're thinking that tithing was, a little bit wrong in the Old Testament, or not the standard in the Old Testament, actually 20% that they wound up giving in these 2 tithes. But then every 3rd year, they gave a 3rd tithe, and that tithe was split between 3. And if you look, and I'll give you the scriptures if you want to look it up, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. This third tithe that was that was given every 3 years was given for the widows and orphans. It's kind of paralleling to our benevolence fund. So it was given in 1 year from the produce and everything you had, and then it was kept for the 3 years and divided. And over that 3 years, it would enable the Israelite people to take care of their widows and orphans. And so it is that it was very important in the Old Testament, and so it is in the New Testament as he brings them here. The first thing he tells us to do is to honor widows in verse 3. It says, honor widows who are widows indeed. Now he's going to go a little bit further into what widows indeed are, but to honor them. Give them respect. They've had a hard life. Now the widows indeed will find their qualifications, and when you look at the qualifications of what he calls a widow indeed, you'll see why they need to be honored. But he says, give them honor. The widows indeed, as we'll look at in the future here a little bit, have nobody to take care of them. If you remember what we read, it says the offspring will take care of them. They become widows indeed if there's no husband and no children, which means there's no one to take care of. So this woman may have raised children, but the children are all deceased now. Or maybe she didn't have any children, and she has no method of income. And there's a special way in which he describes these women here, but he says, honor widows indeed. And then verses 4 and 8, he talks about widows a little bit more. Let me look through it quickly at James chapter 1, verse 27. It says this, this is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep one unstained by the world. So visiting widows and orphans in distress was important, even in the book of James. So here, as we look at the support of widows in this part, he has 2 things he wants to say. First of all, their direct descendants are responsible. Look at verse 4. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Children and grandchildren are responsible for the support of the parents. They're obligated to provide for the parents. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, it says, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long on the earth. And he says, this is the first promise is given with, first command is given with a promise. Honor your mother and father. I think I mentioned that in the past week or two. I don't know how it's applied to whatever somebody's talking about, but it doesn't mean until you're 18. It means all of your life. Honor your mother and father. And part of that is when your mother becomes a widow, or when your parents are in need, you take care of them. You don't say, oh, I'm making my money. And let me tell you, young people today, I'm not saying it's easy on them, but the amount they make today is insane compared to what people made long ago, and even if you count inflation, okay? Our kids are oftentimes well off today. If they do their job right, it doesn't mean they're rolling in the cash, but I remember when I was growing up, it was, in fact, I got a pair of shoes at home my wife wants to get rid of, when you wind up getting thin and they get holes in them, what'd you do? Huh? Yeah, newspaper or mine was cardboard. Cut off a piece of cardboard, trace the thing, put it in there, We stretch the pennies, Today, I love butter on my bread. If I don't put butter on my bread, I'm just not going to eat bread. I don't eat bread that much anyway. But I like real butter, We never had butter in our house. I mean, butter was like a very, 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 very special occasion in our house. Half and half, forget it, Today, we just think this is normal. This is expected today, but it's not. And so we need to realize that, and oftentimes we, who are older, have taken care of our parents, and the younger set needs to take care of them. It doesn't matter your age. If your mother or father is around, make sure they're taken care of. Joseph went down to Egypt, got sold into slavery. What did he do? As soon as he found out that his brothers came down, he recognized them. He said, "How's my father doing?" He says, "Go get my father, bring him down to Egypt. I'm going to take care of him. I have a place down here. God sent me here to do for you." A few examples. Ruth and Boaz, remember? Ruth was a widow. She came and her mom, Naomi, said, "Go harvest in Boaz's field because he is a kinsman, a distant relative." And she did. And it was dangerous in those days because it's kind of interesting. You don't think rape and all that kind of stuff didn't happen in Israel. But it did, because Boaz told her, "Stay close to my workers and come back to my field so that you will be safe." He realized that a young widow of her age, probably attractive, could be in danger. He said, "I will take you. I'm a kinsman of you." When Jesus was on the cross, he only talked to two people. He talked to the thief beside him and said to him, what? "Today you have been in paradise." And he talked to one other person. Who was that? John and his mom. Said, "Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." He made sure he took care of his mom from the cross because he was the eldest son. I don't know where the other brothers were, but he wanted to make sure his mom was taken care of from the cross. We had a funeral here the other day. Joan Colton, unfortunately, she had not attended for years. But in her last 15 or so years, she had Parkinson's. Her daughter moved home and took care of her until the day she died. She actually joined the church back in 47 or something, but hasn't attended for many years. Her mom was, for you that don't know, her mom was Edna Dreisbach, and her aunt was Ruby Barnhill. Some old names of some of you, but that's the connection. I think of Jean Shrewsbury, an older widow. Bruce and Andrea sold their house in town. When her father died, moved down with them to take care of the parents. I was at the chiropractor this last week and had this article. I didn't think of it at the time. I called her back. I said, "Can I get this article?" It's titled, Dear Abby. Anybody read Dear Abby yet still? Okay, she's kind of about, "Dear Abby, overbearing dad makes living at home aggravating for the son. I'm a 34-year-old man who lives with my father." Now I'm going to add a little bit of expression here so you get what I got when I'm reading this. "I'm a 34-year-old man who lives with his father who is 76 years old. I'm currently without a job. But when I have one, I buy food and whatever else is needed for the house. I believe I'm doing my fair share. I love my father dearly, but I can't stand him as a person. He can be rude and verbally abusive. He has told people we know very personal things about me. When we're visiting family, if I ask for something to eat or drink, he'll answer, 'No, you don't need that.' Dad played a major role in ruining a relationship with my mother, with a woman I was dating. I don't invite any of my new friends over because I know he'll have something sarcastic to say." I can read you the whole article here. What is your advice from Abby? What would you say? You're Dear Abby. Get a job and, What's a 34-year-old guy living with his 76-year-old father and complaining because his father doesn't treat him nice? And by the way, I don't have a job now, but when I do have a job, I buy some food for the place. You look on the internet, there's actually articles about the idea of 30-year-olds living with their parents, going back to living home with their parents. I don't know what it is. But at that age, that guy ought to be out given a job. I don't know. And he doesn't say he's got any physical maladies or anything, or whatever that. But he says, I don't have a job. And I realize that sometimes you lose your job, but it's like this is a permanent thing. I'm living with them all the time, and if I have a job, I buy some food and some of the other stuff around the house. you know, if you look on the internet, it's a major problem with young people moving back at home with, and I'm not against people living with their parents. You know, you're single and so forth, that's fine. But the fact that that he is complaining about his father and not really equally contributing to it. It's not that the fathers and mothers are supposed to take care of the children. Who's supposed to take care of the parents? The children. We're supposed to take care of our children. Now, quit dapping your daughter. Oh, I'm just putting it. And if you live with your parents, that's fine. I'm not saying. But this guy's problem is he's not living there because he wants to help out or because he wants to, or because it's convenient for him and you know, whatever. He's living there because he's done the job, wants to loaf there. You know, when he throws a couple dollars to him, and then he wonders why his dad's sarcastic. Now his dad may be a horrible person. I don't know. Don't know the guy. I'm just saying, you know. Children are supposed to take care of their parents as they get older and more unable to take care of themselves. Verse 8. This is the reverse. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. We need to provide for our own. It's not the church's job. It's not the government's job. It's our job to provide for our families. If they need a place to stay, we need to make sure they're safe. And I'm not just talking about old people. I think this may be talking to some of us guys our age as men who need to take care of our widowed moms, you know? We need to make sure that those that are our parents as they get older, that they're taken care of. They've taken care of us when we, oftentimes when we had no ability to take care of ourselves as kids. They've raised us. We need to do that. And that's not the reason. The reason isn't pro quo. It's that we need to do this because it's our responsibility before God to watch over those of our close relatives. And I think it applies to any close relative. You know, if you have a niece or a nephew that got kicked out of the house for some reason or parents can't take care of them right, maybe it applies there too. But specifically here, it's talking about any dependents that you have. We need to make sure they're taken care of. I've got 3 quotes. I thought these were kind of interesting. One is from one of the commentators. He says, the man, and this is the idea that he says that a person who doesn't do this is worse than an infidel. How can he be worse than an unbeliever or infidel? Well, he says this, the man who switches off a light is worse than the man who has never known anything brighter than a candle. It took me a while to think about that. The man who switches off the light is worse than the man who has never known anything brighter than the candle. So in other words, I think what he's trying to say here is the unbeliever never knew God. How can you be worse than an unbeliever? Well, if you know God and reject God. And so he's saying, you know what you're supposed to do and you're not doing it. The Bible says, to him who knows what to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Okay? We know what we're supposed to do. There's a Dutch proverb. I thought this was interesting. It frequently seems easier for one poor father to bring up 10 children than for 10 rich children to provide for one poor father. Frequently seems easier for one poor father to bring up 10 children than for 10 rich children to provide for one poor father. And then Aristotle said this, not that he's our go-to person, but interesting that even in the secular, outside the realm of Christianity, a man must himself starve before he would see his parents starve. That was the secular view of the day. Provide for the parents. Provide for those in need, especially those in our own family. Verses 5 through 7 then goes to talking about the conduct of widows. And let's look at that a little bit. First of all, it says in verse 5, let me just read it here for you again. Now she who is a widow indeed, going back to the widow indeed part, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. She's fixed her hope on God. She trusts in God. The widow indeed has a faith, and she's following that faith. Not all moms or widows do that, but he's saying the widow indeed, as he's looking at it here, because it's a special kind of widow in the church that he's looking at, he says that's what she does. She continues in entreaties night and day. She is godly intercession for those that have need. And then in verse 6 it says, but she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. So some widows say, oh, I got the money from my husband and, free and clear now, don't have to worry about him. Let me just go out and enjoy life and have fun and do whatever I want, And that's a no-go. She's dead while she's still even living. So the widow indeed doesn't do that. The widow indeed takes her financial resources, her time, and who's she spending it for? God. It's interesting because most people are able to retire from the job at some point. If you look in the scriptures, the only person that ever retired in the Old Testament was the priest. I think it was 55. I'm still going. I'll be going for a bunch more years. But retirement is not something you see in the Bible a whole lot. But I will tell you, whatever job you retire from, there's one job you would never retire from if you're a believer. And what is that? Serving God. You will never retire. And in fact, I think retirement can be a blessing because the person that's retired can spend more time serving God than they did otherwise. Now they no longer, maybe they have a pension, maybe they get a Social Security, whatever. They may have more time to be able to spend on supporting God and supporting and doing what is exactly what he's talking about here. Entreaties, prayers, denying wanton pleasures. They're saying, oh, I got my, now there's nothing wrong with going on a cruise, okay? Let me just say that front up. But some people retire and say, oh, let me spend my money before my kids get it, I'm going to own 3 cruises a year, going to do a lot of travel, and it's okay to do that stuff. But what priority does God have in your life? And this is the widow indeed that the church needs to be especially caring for is the person who says, I'm putting God first in my life. And that should be our job regardless of whether we're retired or not. Retirement does not end the job of serving God. There's a lady that I knew was one of my great prayer warriors. Most of the people that have prayed for me faithfully, really dramatically, have been retired people, and usually ladies, oftentimes widows. And they've held me up in prayer. And to be honest with you, I don't know what my life would have been like without those prayers, but I might not be standing here without that. The prayers of these ladies may have been what kept me on track. And so it's important for us to be able to honor these ladies and to know that widows can really be helpful to us. Then verses 9 through 16, I've entitled this, All Widows Have a Ministry. All widows have a ministry. The ministry of an older woman. Here it comes. Some feel that this may have been a special group of widows set aside for ministry in the church, like deacons or deaconesses. When they look at this place that's called Widows Indeed, they have a list here if you look in verse 9. Let a widow be put on the list if, and there's 6 ifs in this section. If she does this, if she's here, and the 6 qualifications are, I'll just list them briefly for you here. One is that she's 60 years old and has a reputation for good works. So not a younger lady, 60 years old or older. If she has brought up children, why? Because the widows indeed are those that can advise the younger children, the younger women. This is how you treat a husband. This is how you treat your children. This is how you have a problem, Now we're at the age where some people are asking us, you raise 5 children, they're all 25 to 35, and some of them have had disabilities and so forth. How did you do it? What's the advice? And that's what older ladies can do. Even if they're not widows, but the widow who has raised children can be put on this list, and she's raised children. She knows how to give that kind of advice. This is not putting down women that don't have children, or some women maybe have the gift of singleness and never marry. That's okay. But these widows, at least that he's talking about here, have raised children. They've also shown hospitality to strangers, one of the qualifications for elder. Back in that day, it was very dangerous for a person to go traveling, because they didn't have hotels or places you could stay that were easy. So to entertain another believer was a very important thing. So they've entertained or they've been hospitality to strangers. They've washed the saints' feet, which means they've been humble. They've been willing to wash feet. It doesn't matter if you come to my house, got dirty feet, I'm going to wash them. I'm going to take care of you. A certain amount of humility. She's assisted those in distress. I sometimes think of Dorcas. It doesn't say she was a widow, but I wonder if she was. When she died, remember in that story about Peter, they all took him up and showed him all the things she had made for them. All the widows did. She made us this and this and this. And I think that's maybe even a better illustration of verse 16 as we get there in a few seconds. And then she devoted herself to every good work. These are godly women that over their lives have dedicated themselves to God. And now at age 60, they're widows. And it seems almost like he may have brought these widows into a certain section and said, these are maybe a certain class of widows in the church. I don't know. But they were special, at least those who had this type of a position and that kind of a life. And this is the type of godly life that we should all desire to live, but You women, here's the example. Follow these kind of ladies. When you get to be 60 years of age, will you be able to say, I've got 4 of these 6 characteristics, or 5 of them? How many will have you been able to do? I think of widows in the lives of different people. Elijah was the widow of Zarephath that put him up. For Elisha, it was the Shunammite woman. You remember Anna the prophetess? Where do we find her? Anybody know where we see Anna the prophetess? Oh, come on. Someone's got to know Anna. Christmas story, Simeon, temple. They bring Jesus to the temple to dedicate him, circumcise him, give him his name. Anna's there, the prophetess. A widow for, I think it said 84 years. Some think she may be 84 years old and a widow for most of her life. Some think she had been a widow for 84 years, serving in the temple day and night. That was her future as a widow. I think of my parents. My mom and dad died a year apart, maybe 2 years apart. And my dad was a pastor, and he became a visitation pastor in his senior years. He visited for First Baptist of Woodbury. And he went and visited all the shut-ins, would take them communion or visit them or take them the bulletin. And my mom went every place with them. My dad died. Went into the hospital for a simple operation. 30 days later, he was dead of a blood infection. And I found out a couple of years later when I talked to people how lonely my mom had been. I mean, we tried to, we're 45 minutes away. We go down, we communicate. She'd come up here, but, it's hard when you've been married over 45 years to the same person. Served with them. She continued to visit. What are you doing, Mom? Oh, I'm visiting. Church didn't pay anymore. Dad was gone. No pay for the job. But she continued the ministry, kept on visiting those same people, to my knowledge, until the day she died. A widow indeed, who continues in ministry, who raised children and was able to serve God. I doubt that very many people recognize that. I doubt that she got very many accolades. But I'll tell you, those shut-ins she continued to visit after my father passed away, we're so grateful. And after she passed away, I continued to communicate with some of them in my annual Christmas letter, but they're all gone in glory now too, I'm sure. And then lastly, I think of Jean Shrewsbury in our own church. Older woman's been around, done many different things in our church throughout the years. I think of Joan Chambers. Is she here this morning? There she is, Joan. Married, godly husband who taught school. Her son passed away before your husband, didn't he? Or after? Before. And he had my daughter Carissa, taught her, was her softball coach. And, a family served all these years, and now here she is still in the church as a widow, continuing to, be a part of our church. I honor you, Joan. It's not that you're doing a lot. I don't know what you do at home. Maybe you pray all the time. I don't really know, but I just, I really respect you as a person. The ministry of an older widow, verses 9 and 10. And then in verses 11 through 16, the ministry of younger women. First of all, in verses 11 and 13, what they shouldn't do. And, young widow, lots of time on their hands, still active, able to get around. What are some of the things that could happen? Well, verses 11 to 13, it says, but refuse to put a younger widow on this list. This list seems to be a list that people made a commitment to, that widows made. I'm going to be committed to serving God and the church. It was almost like a vow that they made to the church, these widows indeed. And it says, don't let them be put on the same list where they make this vow, which is kind of interesting because we have a whole system of females in the Catholic Church that are, committed from the early life oftentimes to service and celibacy. But that's not his recommendation here. He says, starting in verse 11, refuse to put a younger widow on the list for when they feel sensual desire to have the relationships they had with a husband, in disregard for Christ, they get married, and thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge, which is why I think this was a pledge that these widows made to say, we're going to serve God, we're going to continue to be a part of the church, and they probably bolstered the church's ability to serve in many ways. At the same time, they also learn, verses 13, to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things which are not proper to mention. What do they have to do all their time? If you're taking care of them and they have all this time, it's easy for them to get into trouble and do things that the widows indeed, 60 and older, would not be doing. So he said, I have my recommendation. They should not do that kind of stuff. And I think the first illustration I think it was The Sound of Music. You know, I remember she, said, I think there's a nun who's not, or a woman who's not going to be a nun. I couldn't find the exact quote, but that was the idea. She had fallen in love. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, as you look at this, what they should do in verses 14 and 15, that's Paul's exact recommendation. He says, therefore, I want the younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. Now, he's not saying that they have to get married, but as opportunity provides, allow them to get married. Cause them to get married. Tell them, go ahead and search for a husband. Have children. And there's a couple of principles I'm going to follow up, so I'm not going to go more deeply into that at this point. But John MacArthur said this, and I want to just quote him from one of his commentaries. This is the contemporary view that children are an inconvenience that cramps one's lifestyle is repulsive to the Lord. On the contrary, the Bible calls children a gift from the Lord. It is a high calling and blessed privilege of bearing children. Now, not everybody can have children. I realize that. Some are single all their lives. Some folks are not able to have babies, don't have children, but through adoptions, foster care, ministry in the church, there's many ways in which people can have ministry to youth, and I encourage that, to maintain a godly home. And then this last verse 16, it says, if any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, let her assist them, and let not the church be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So in other words, widows taking care of widows. If an older widow has the means to take care of their daughter widow or some other widow in their family, they should do that, so that the church is not burdened to have to do that. But again, we're going back to the family taking care of family. And when I think of that, I think of Naomi and Ruth. There's Naomi and Ruth come back, and Naomi takes care of Ruth. Naomi's a widow, but she's got a daughter who's a widow because her son died. Naomi's son died, and Ruth had married the son, so she takes her back with her. So it's a widow taking care of widows. There are a lot of good principles in this, but I think, I guess my theme at the end I'll give you as a general theme, but let me give you just 5 principles that I pulled out of this. And I thought about just revolving the sermon around the 5 principles, but you know what? I like going through the text. I like to look at all the text and what it says. So let's read these principles. Let me just read these principles to you. And you can write them down if you're taking notes here. Families are responsible to take care of their widow relatives and other truly needy relatives. If you've got someone who's needy in your family, if you have a widow, parent, mom, dad, it's your responsibility. Second, widows over 60 serving God should be honored and provided for. Women over 60, widows over 60 who are dedicated to the church, we should make sure that if they don't have children to take care of them, that we take care of them. That's part of what the Benevolence Fund is set aside to do, although we don't have a whole lot in this day and age that are in our church at least, that are in that category, but that's what we should do. Younger widows should be encouraged to remarry as opportunity permits. Okay? Get a family. You know, if you look at all the Hallmark films, it seems like every third Hallmark film has someone who's lost their husband and they can't get over it, can't get remarried or whatever. Paul says, go for it. Principle 4, homemaking and motherhood, and this is important to me. Homemaking and motherhood are the most honorable of occupations. If you're a homemaker, don't put yourself down. I didn't look up the statistics. It was one thing I was going to do and I didn't. But, they'll tell you what the value of a homemaker or a mother is, They take all the tasks and put a dollar amount to them, It's like they should be paid $135,000 a year or something, I often told my wife, if one of us is to die, it probably should be me because you can replace me with money, but I can never replace you with all the stuff you do. Women, the wives, never put yourself down because, I'm just a homemaker. No, you're not a homemaker. You're a homemaker, and you're a mother, and you're taking care of your children. Now, that doesn't put down people who have to go to work for some reason. We resisted doing a daycare for so many years because of that. Some people can't do that, and that's why we provide a daycare, so that we can have a place for other women to tell children about the love of Christ when their mothers aren't there. So it's a way of taking care of mothers also. And then principle 5, those without children at home are still able to influence youth through adoption, foster care, and church ministries. There are many ways. Don't feel like, oh, well, I don't fit this criteria of a widow or have children or whatever. You have great many opportunities to be able to influence the youth of the next generation, and it's so important. Theme, treat the family of God like true family and always support our parents. Treat the family of God like true family and always support our parents. Dear Lord, as we close this morning, we thank you for those that have taken care of us growing up. I think of many of my Sunday school teachers and growing up, and some of them, in fact, a number of them were widows. And some of them are still alive today, not many. But I thank you for the impact that they had in my life because they were dedicated to teaching children in Sunday school. Thank you for my own mom. And I ask that you might help us as believers to never be worse than an infidel, but to always take care of our families, those that have needs, whether they be special needs children or widows or parents that are getting older and don't have the resources. May we always take care of them as you recommend and as you demand, actually command in your word. In Jesus' name, amen.